It's really amazing to be here together in person, in physical space. Yeah, woo! So we're gathered here today on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people, and specifically Astor Place, where we're gathered, was once a central meeting point of three Lenape tribes: the Canarsie, the Sapahanican, and the Manhattan peoples, who called this place Kintakoying, or Crossroads of Three Nations, because it was a place where three major trails intersected. And as was tradition for meeting places, here, perhaps where this red stage is set up, was a sacred oak tree under which people would meet, trade, play, hold tribal councils and ceremonies, and otherwise make indigenous life. Where we're gathered today is, and will always be indigenous space, and New York City is home to the highest concentration of indigenous peoples in the US, more than 100,000 people. On these Lenape homelands, we join indigenous people here and across the world in their ongoing struggle against settler colonialism. And for those of us who are settlers, that means interrogating our relationship to the land that we are now on. As Kanaka Maoli Indigenous Hawaiian scholar Noelani Goodyear Kaupua tells us, asks us to ask ourselves, given my and my family's relationship to history and to the other people who exist here, what is my kuleana, my relational obligation to this land and its native stewards? So to imagine a different relationship to land and to each other is also the work of abolition. I'm gonna pass it to Betty to say a few words about Chinatown Art Brigade.
Thanks, Linda. So good to see everyone. The weather goddesses were really good to us today, so thank you for sure. Because there would be a downpour at this point, but I'm glad it's not. So my name is Betty Yu, and I'm with Chinatown Art Brigade, and I use she/her pronouns. So just to talk, you're going to hear from this lovely panel of speakers in a moment. But wanted to introduce a little bit, talk about Chinatown Art Brigade, and I'm going to slow down because we have this lovely Alberto who is helping us with ASL interpretation. So please just give a round of applause to Alberto. And Kim, who is also going to be helping and switching out in a bit. So please, a round of applause also. It's hard work. So I wanted to introduce Chinatown Art Brigade. We are intergenerational collective driven by the fundamental belief that our cultural, material, and aesthetic modes of production have the power to advance social change, racial justice, and economic justice. We are comprised of Asian American, Asian diasporic identifying artists, media makers, writers, educators, scholars, activists, all who have really deep roots in Manhattan's Chinatown and the Chinatowns throughout New York City, for that matter. Together, we make work that centers art and culture as a way to support community-led organizing against gentrification, displacement, and racialized capitalism. We know that these systems of state-sanctioned gentrification and mass displacement are inextricably tied and part of the same system of the prison industrial complex that incarcerates and criminalizes and perpetuates state-sanctioned violence against our communities of color. So today we're here to talk about how our struggles are much more aligned with one another, and we have more in common than differences. But I'm going to pass it back to Linda to talk a little bit about our theme and provide a framework of abolition for our teach-in today.
So this event was inspired by the protests that happened over this past summer in response to the most recent spate of police murders of Black people and the more public dialogue around abolition and defunding the police that happened after that, the rise in violent public attacks on Asian Americans, the shooting and targeting of massage parlors and their vulnerable Asian migrant women workers in Georgia. And here in the city's carceral response to these events in the form of the NYPD Asian Hate Crime Task Force. That the first national conversations on race and racist violence that took place after the events of the summer and the uprisings of the summer was centered on Stop Asian Hate Crimes, which is a criminal justice framework that's centered on the individual perpetrator and which sets up the expansion of the prison industrial complex, is consistent with how Asian Americans have historically been used as a wedge between white hegemonic power and racialized groups, particularly Black and brown folks. And is also not an accurate depiction or understanding of how racist violence actually shows up in our own communities, stratified by class, gender, immigration status, language, and the histories of the places and how people come here. So none of this is new. So we're holding this event with the amazing people here in order to center histories of Asian American organizing and racial justice work that have been made possible by and which contribute to the rich histories of abolition and organizing against the racist capitalist settler state that is the US. Our understanding of abolition is really informed by the Black radical tradition and generations of Black freedom fighters who have articulated abolition as a political vision and a practice that demands the abolition of all forms of policing and police because it understands that policing itself is the problem. So abolition means the fundamental redefinition of ideas of safety and of justice away from the police, the law, the courts, as a way of dealing with our social, economic, political, and interpersonal problems, meaning that the entire foundation of our political order, which is built on anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism, must be fundamentally rethought and dismantled.
Yes. And I just wanted to remind folks that it is not rude if during the program you're listening and meditating over our words, and if you want to make a contribution to the altar. I'm not sure, actually, I don't want to put Wu or Esther on the spot. Do you guys want to ground us in because I know that Red Canary song often opens with a candlelight visual or offerings of an altar. Ground us a little bit in the altar, and we're again hoping folks can answer this question about a liberated future. What does that look like to you? And you would write it on a yellow piece of paper, put it in a red envelope, and then please place it on the altar. But I don't know where Wu is at the moment. But do you want to say a few words about the altar? Wu, yes. I am so sorry. I don't know where Wu is at the moment. But we will circle back if Wu's not here. But please, please make a contribution. And the altar again is really paying respects to all those lost to white supremacy, state sanctioned. Lost to state-sanctioned violence. And so we really, really hope that you contribute something to the altar. So before we pass it on to our first speaker, which will be M, he from CAAAV, Asian Tenants Union. Woohoo! I just want to offer, so Linda mentioned a little bit about the history of this place, Astor Place. The history of resistance, particularly of indigenous folks who are, ancestral indigenous folks to this land. But I also want to bring attention to maybe something that is little known about this area. So this site has long been a site of resistance. The Chinese Guild was actually founded around the corner on St. Mark's between 2nd and 3rd Avenue. around 1892. And they were formed to oppose the state violence, racism, and dehumanization of Chinese folks due to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed by this government, as we know, the only legislation that bars an ethnic group from coming to this country to this day. The members were mainly hand laundry workers, working class folks, who were systematically kept out of all kinds of industries, right, and discriminated against. They were largely formed too to combat the anti-Asian violence, surveillance, and intimidation by police forces, by the NYPD at that time. So to kind of remember that this is literally the site of lots of resistance. And I also want to say that around the same time that year, the Chinese Equal Rights League was also formed around the corner. It was modeled after the Equal Rights League, formed 20 years earlier, before championing African American civil rights and citizenship rights. Also, that same year, there was a rally at Cooper Union, right there, right behind you, in 1892 as well, where Black folks and Chinese folks together spoke passionately about the need to advance equal rights for all. So just to ground us in this place, and this place has a lot of history, right, of resistance. But also, I wanted to say a little bit more about, why abolition and why are we talking about this within the context of Asian American community. So Linda talked about, obviously, the anti-Asian hate. In response to it, a lot of Asian groups have been calling for more police presence, which we're absolutely opposed to because it just criminalizes folks of color and it pits us against each other. But also, as a working class kid who grew up in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, to garment worker parents, I often think about how do I talk to folks like my parents, folks of their generation who are in their 70s and 80s. How do we actually see folks where they're at and not use these sort of words like, abolition and white supremacy? Like, what does that actually mean? And how do we talk to people about that? Folks in our communities, monolingual, immigrant, Chinese speaking or Korean speaking, South Asian speaking monolingual immigrants. How do we actually have these conversations with them? And I think that that's also where the impetus for this teach-in comes from, and that the carceral state is part of the same system of labor exploitation, gentrification, the system of incarceration. All these things are really tied together. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the new jail that is being built in Chinatown. They're breaking ground next year, and how the Museum of Chinese America, how a lot of these cultural institutions are implicit and complicit in building this jail, and how these are all kind of tied together. Should I introduce the first speaker? Yes, okay. So I think that for interpretation, maybe we can do musical chairs if that's okay. Because this mic doesn't go that far. So I'm going to introduce M. Oh yeah, M. He is with the CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities, and the Asian Tenants Union, and has been doing a lot of organizing with Asian immigrants, having these conversations about abolition and incarceration in the prison industrial complex. So here we go. Thanks, Em.
Hello, everyone. I'm Em. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm an organizer with CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities. CAAAV has been here organizing Asian communities in so-called New York City, Lenape land, since 1986. And we've organized around a bunch of different issues, but the past 2 decades, we've been focusing on housing justice and stopping gentrification, in particular in Chinatown, and also in Western Queens. So we have the Chinatown Tenants Union, we have a youth chapter, and then we also have the Asian Tenants Union. And so I'm an organizer with the Asian Tenants Union as the Chinese public housing organizer. And the Asian Tenants Union, we organize Chinese, Bangla, and Korean-speaking public housing residents in Western Queens. We believe that our power comes from our relationships and our decision-making power about our own homes and our neighbors and our neighborhoods. So a lot of what I do is, having conversations with public housing residents in Mandarin and Cantonese, and building deep relationships and getting them to see this vision of working class people reclaiming New York City in our collective interest, and seeing that vision and moving powerfully together, and also winning our campaigns. Currently, we're in a campaign against the privatization of public housing. And so we recently won, and we stopped the. We stopped the NYCHA Trust, or the Blueprint Plan, from passing through, which would have privatized all of public housing in New York City. So when I first started doing explicitly like abolitionist organizing, which was around what was mentioned, the de Blasio's plan to build new jails, I asked one of my mentors, Kara Page, who does a lot of healing justice and Black liberation work that is inherently abolitionist. How do I explain abolition and like transformative justice to people from a variety of understandings and familiarities with it? Because I was going to host a meeting in Chinatown, with a bunch of different community members that have influence over the neighborhood, and they actually brought up a story from CAAAV, and how CAAAV during Hurricane Sandy stepped up and did mutual aid for the neighborhood when our elders and people in our neighborhood was stuck up in their homes, up elderly people up a few floor, up in several floors up without electricity or water, and CAAAV organized to get our people what we need, like phone chargers, water, electricity, and that showed how when the state fails us, when the state is not there to meet our needs, we have our community and we have our solutions, and we do it through our relationships and our neighborly relations, and how we are have this commitment to take care of each other. And so that showed me the story of how we see it in our how we go through crisis over crisis in this country, that we come up with solutions for our own communities. And I think when talking about abolition, a big learning for a lot of people is that it's a project not only of taking down prisons and carceral systems, but also what we do to build the communities and relationships we need to live beyond the state. And we see the state not being there for us a lot of the times, and so telling those stories and showing those possibilities is really important. And so in my organizing with public housing residents, a lot of my recent conversations where abolition comes up is around our sense of safety and our fear of the anti-Asian attacks and violence that have been happening. And I think...
Okay. Sorry, the amplified sound is really bad because we need to be mindful of neighbors. We'll try to... Is that even louder than the mic?
No. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, I will amplify my volume. There you go. And so in these conversations, moving through the emotions of fear and figuring out what safety means to us, that's where the organizing tools of having deep conversations and agitating each other, like interrupting to be like, what do you really mean by you feel safe when the police are in the subway station? Or what actually is true safety? Or why is it that police are our only option, or the normal option that we think of? When we actually think through materially, when there are language barriers, what is this policeman at the subway station actually going to do for us? And so what I've been learning is, like through the story of CAAAV doing mutual aid during Hurricane Sandy, we need to show the material collective interest we have in abolition. What we've seen work with our base of working class Asian folks is linking it to property. And so for public housing and for gentrification in Chinatown, we can see whose side is the police on. They're going to protect property over your own homes, over like what they're going to protect your landlord's house rather than your home and your right to have a home. And I think for public housing, there's also doing this anti-privatization campaign, bringing back the land acknowledgement and decolonization. I think there's a lot of, we're not there yet, but there's a lot of possibility for understanding how housing is not for profit, it should be public, and then also understanding land as not private or only for humans. And I think for me personally, decolonization and understanding safety with the land and decolonization has been really been really important in understanding safety. And another example that moves our members is, as Betty talked about, like a lot of Asian working class folks are low-wage workers who are really exploited. And so thinking through their own experiences with police and their bosses when there's wage theft and they go and hold their bosses accountable for the wages that were stolen from them. When the boss calls the police, who are the police there for? Understanding that the police are there to protect the bosses and property and this exploitative relationship. So I think doing organizing with CAAAV has taught me that these material, showing our collective material interest is really important, and then also how we have these conversations. And I think transformative justice and principally struggling through the messiness and the emotions is also really important. And I think what I'm learning also is that for a lot of our folks, safety is based in a desire for authority. And I think one of my goals as an organizer is to understand, is to help people understand that they have the inherent right to have authority over their own lives, and that we do not need to look towards the state for that authority. And through our deep relationships and our collective people power, we can decide what happens to our own homes and how we keep ourselves safe. To conclude, through organizing with CAAAV, Asian Tenants Union, I think it's important to use organizing tools to get people to understand what is the collective material interest, and also really leaning into the nothing is this or that. And I think transformative justice and indigenous pedagogy and knowledge teaches us that things aren't this or that, and to really move into what's in between and struggle through that together.
CAAAV is also looking for Bangla, Chinese, Korean, and other interpreters. So if you're interested in practicing some of these skills that is talking about with CAAAV, check out their social media. Next, I'm going to introduce Annie Tan, who is a teacher, activist, and storyteller.
Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
I have really been contemplating that chant since George Floyd was murdered last year, and thinking about what actually keeps us safe. I've been an educator in classrooms for 10 years now, which is bonkers to me. I teach 5th grade, and how many of you as students felt like you weren't heard or safe in your classrooms ever? K through 12, all right? And oftentimes that's because, as Em said earlier, we're looking for a person of authority to say, hey, this is wrong or this is right, but also to hear you, right? Something I've also been contemplating in the past few years is this quote from disabilities rights activist from South Africa. Nothing about us without us is for us, all right? I'm gonna say that again. Nothing about us without us is for us, all right? People did not ask to be in public housing projects where there's cops going up and down stairwells. They didn't ask for cops kicking them out from Washington Square Park just a few minutes walk away at 10 p.m. They're not asking for these things that don't actually make them feel safe. And in 2014, we had a man named Akai Gurley who was killed in a stairwell of his apartment building in the pink houses in Brooklyn. And he was killed by a cop who was patrolling that stairwell, an Asian American cop named Peter Liang, who was startled in that dark stairwell because lights aren't fixed in NYCHA housing, of course. Em was talking about NYCHA housing, and elevators weren't working, so Akai Gurley had to use the stairs, right? And Peter Liang shot a bullet which bounced off a wall and straight into Akai Gurley's heart. Now CAAAV, which I have worked with as a Chinatown Tenants Union member and Asian Tenants Union member, said straight up in 2014, we support Akai Gurley. Black Lives Matter, right? This was not a popular statement from our community. In 2016, when Peter Liang was found guilty of manslaughter, 10,000 Asian Americans who look like me, including some of my cousins, went to Prospect Park to say, this is one tragedy and two victims, that Peter Liang was alive, but he shouldn't go to jail for killing someone. And Akai Gurley's family is devastated. And I know that devastation because my family also lost someone in 1982. I'm related to a man named Vincent Chin, who was murdered by two white men who thought he was Japanese during an auto crisis. And Vincent was Chinese, of course, and they beat him to death a week before he was supposed to get married, before my relatives were supposed to be at the wedding, and my family went to his funeral instead. And I know if those guys, those two white men, were told by a white judge who was a prisoner of war during World War II in Japan, these aren't the kinds of men you send to jail. Judge Charles Kaufman said, these two men will never kill again. They're gonna be out in public, and they never served time for the murder of my cousin Vincent Chin, who was murdered June 19th, 39 years ago. And so when those 10,000 Asian Americans in 2016 said, we support Peter Liang, I was crushed. And a lot of us were crushed because I saw Jesse Jackson in footage hugging my great auntie Lily Chin, the mother of Vincent Chin, knowing that it was racial solidarity and racial justice campaigns that get our names known. Not enough people know Vincent Chin's name today, but Jesse Jackson and all of the other racial justice coalitions that existed in Michigan and across the nation said, we want justice for Vincent Chin and we will not tolerate racial violence. CAAAV was actually founded because of the murder of my cousin Vincent Chin. Anyway, I say all that because CAAAV actually had me take a stance because members of CAAAV were doxxed by our own community. Our own members said, we don't trust you, CAAAV. Hundreds and hundreds of Facebook reviews of CAAAV gave CAAAV 1-star rating saying, you don't support us. You don't support Asian American communities because you sided with Black lives. Do we believe that? No. Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
And that means believing that Black lives matter as well as Asian lives. Because all lives don't matter if Black lives don't matter. So I spoke up publicly. They were trying to compare Peter Liang to my cousin Vincent Chin. They said Peter Liang, this Asian American cop who was alive, was similar in injustice to my cousin Vincent. And I said no. It is those racial justice campaigns and solidarity that said Vincent Chin's name mattered. And we have to say Black Lives Matter and say that proudly. And my family was not happy. They said, don't conflate Vincent's name, our family's name, with Black Lives Matter. In 2016, this was 2 years after the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and there was a lot of education we had to do. Another campaign that happened after the murders of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling came out called Letters for Black Lives, which translated letters in 26 Asian languages so that we could actually start talking about this. It's not just about us. Justice is not just us. Nothing about us without us is for us, right? And we have to stand here and we have to make sure that we remember that history, that this position that we say out loud right now, Black Lives Matter, was not a popular decision in 2014, a popular position, nor is standing for Palestine, or police-free schools, or all the things we have to stand for in order for change to happen. Abolition is one of them. And I'm a teacher. I have a lot of coworkers who don't know what abolition means. What I tell them is that we have a bucket, all this money for police officers to harass people at Washington Square Park at 10 p.m. at night. Hundreds and hundreds of NYPD officers 5 days ago swarming for people who were just chilling outside. That's not going to my students, not going to staff, not going to counselors, guidance counselors, and school counselors, and social workers, and public housing. That's how we keep us safe, actually. No one came in saying, I want a police officer in my classroom taking a student away. That's not how this works. That student wants me to talk to them and hear them and make changes based on what they need. How many of us had a teacher who heard us, who understood us? I hope we have a few, sort of, kind of. I know we have a few things. And that's what we have to do as teachers, too. We have to hear the people in front of us and say, what matters to you? What does safety look like to you in this classroom? That means away from physical harm. That means their mental health is met. That means we give them the resources that the state didn't give us. Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
And I hope that really helps us think about what community safety, not just police safety, looks like. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to introduce Salonee Bhaman from the Asian American Feminist Collective.
Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. My name is Salonee Bhaman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective. Can you all hear me? Hopefully? Okay, I'll try and shout in a little bit. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about an open letter the Asian American Feminist Collective wrote in September of 2020, where we asked everyone on this stage, certainly, many of whom signed, all of whom signed, to join us in asking for cop-free communities, asking our community members to imagine what safety would look like without an anti-Asian hate crime task force. And to really think about if that would make us feel safe. If what we needed was a more multilingual police force, if that would make us feel safe. And if not, what might actually help. And as we wrote that letter, we called on so much of the research and work that other people on this stage have done. And I do want to talk about it a little bit because it's so beautiful that we are kind of all gathered here today, and it's such a privilege to get to kind of talk about all of these different intellectual threads coming together. And I also just wanted to note that that letter was written in the aftermath of a lot of attacks against Asian American elders. And our fear was real, but I think that it was also really brave to think about what we might be able to do with that fear that actually addressed it, rather than putting a different kind of Band-Aid on it. What we found as we were writing and as we were reading is that the NYPD doesn't make many people feel safe. Our communities actually stand to face greater harm because of the police. Looking at studies that CAAAV did in the 1990s, they found that almost half of anti-Asian, racist, violent incidents were actually police-involved incidents. The police were the ones perpetrating the violence. And we started to think a little bit about what violence is and how we think about it, because often when we imagine a violent incident, we think of a moment of rupture, something really traumatic that's happening to someone on the street. We think about a moment where someone is harmed, and we think about this kind of dramatic flashpoint. And we wanted to think about all of the other kind of slower violence that's happening all around us. The violence of street vendors not being able to sell on the street because the police are harassing them, or the violence of the NYPD colluding with ICE and other immigration authorities to make people feel unsafe in their places of work. We wanted to challenge people to think of who counted when they talked about Asian Americans. Did refugees count? Did low-wage workers count? Did sex workers count? Did massage parlor workers count? And if all of those people count in the kind of wild imaginary we have of what Asian America is, then did the cops make them feel safe? And resoundingly, we found that the answer was really no. At AAFC, we think a lot about kind of the strange and fractured coalition that does make up Asian America. And often if it's still a useful category for us to keep using as a community. And as we were thinking about anti-Asian violence specifically, we kept coming around to the idea that our comrades at Drum and Equality Labs and the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective had put forth after 9/11, that actually violence against Asians can look all sorts of ways. And in the aftermath of 9/11, what kept other members of our community safe, South Asian community safe, was not the NYPD. It was organizing and solidarity and showing up for each other and sharing information, and often hiding people from the police when they were coming for them unfairly. And so in that kind of moment, we were prompted to think about what we actually do have in common as an Asian American community, and how we might be able to tap those resources to keep each other safe. What would it mean to have a real language justice platform where people had access to the benefits they needed? What would it mean to have a tenants union for every building? What would it mean to have resources for people to make sure that they were fed, that they were housed, that they knew who to talk to, that they were going to go to a safe school and feel heard and have a classroom size that worked for them, where there was a sense of abundance. And I think I just wanted to say really quickly too, we are all in such debt to the Black feminists in our lives and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know that when AAFC first started thinking about this, we hadn't all called ourselves abolitionists. I don't know that we would have defined ourselves that way universally, but we had our wonderful Rachel, who had been organizing against the Chinatown jail and No New Jails and shared so much with us. And slowly, through a summer of sweaty protests and thinking about all of these things in tandem, I think we started to realize that abolition was sort of the only way forward for us, because it was the only way that our commitments could were actually justified. It was the only way that we could think of a society for everyone. And I think a big piece of that was starting to imagine what we would do with all of those billions of dollars that currently fund a military occupying force in our city. And people had great ideas. I remember asking my friends what they would fund instead of the NYPD, and I got answers from, luxury A-train to smaller class sizes to community gardens. We have a huge untapped well of imagination if we think about how we might actually build community intentionally. So yeah, thank you to all of you. I've learned so much from everyone on the stage for years now. So I'm so grateful to be here.
Our next speaker is Esther from Red Canary Song. And let's give it a round of applause for Esther. And I'm so sorry, because we're gonna do little breakout sessions so that you can get to know folks a little bit more on the panel. We're just asking folks if they can keep their remarks 5 to 7 minutes, and then we have 3 more speakers, so bear with us, and then we'll do our breakout sessions. So thank you, Esther.
Okay, I will make it quick then. Hi, I'm Esther. I'm a part of Red Canary Song. I'm an organizer with Red Canary Song, and we are a sex workers and allies grassroots collective that does massage parlor outreach. And we're also advocating for the full decriminalization of sex work in New York. Before I start, I really want to have a moment of silence to honor the lives lost in March during the Atlanta shooting. So if I can just take a few seconds. So on March 16, 8 women were killed in Atlanta during a shooting, and 6 of those were migrant Asian women. Red Canary started in 2017 when Yang Song, a massage business worker, fell to her death after a police raid at her place of work. It's not sure if she jumped or she fell or what happened in that instance, but Red Canary sprouted out of that movement to really protect migrant Asian women and sex workers. The reason why we're a sex workers collective that also does massage work outreach is because of this conflation between the 2 categories that often appear, and it's also due to the criminalization of the sex industry. It's also due to the criminalization of this industry, which creates an opacity within the massage businesses. So although the majority of Chinese massage businesses are licensed businesses that don't provide sexual services, it is assumed that Asian American women and Asian migrant women would, because of the Page Act and because of a long history of the hypersexualization of Asian women. So yeah, sex workers' rights groups have not had a lot of support for the majority of history in the United States, except for abolitionist groups. In the early 2000s, abolitionist groups were the only allies to sex workers because they knew how deeply ingrained the criminal legal system and criminalization is harmful to women, to LGBTQ folks, to people who may not have other avenues for income, and turn to sex work as the most lucrative form of employment. I guess I didn't really have a speech written, but the erasure of sex workers and massage workers from the broader Stop Asian Hate movement has been heartbreaking, right? The increased policing as a solution to what happened in Atlanta shows how absolutely removed the broader sort of like Asian American movement is from what is happening on the ground to sex workers to massage workers whose primary fear of violence is not from clients, but from the police, who have historically suffered years and decades of trauma of NYPD harassment, sexually, non-sexually, sometimes just physical harassment, violence, abuse, manipulation tactics to funnel them into the human trafficking intervention court system, which incentivizes consensual sex workers and massage workers to self-identify as trafficking victims in order to access social services that should be provided by the government in the first place, right? When COVID happened in 2020, a lot of the mutual aid work that Canary was doing was work that the government should have been providing in the first place, right? We were doing cash jobs to pay rent for people because Chinatown businesses were going down and no one was going to massage businesses, on top of the stigma that, you know, Asian American women are, you know, carriers of disease and viruses. We were doing grocery jobs that should have been provided for. We were trying to figure out ways to make sure that these women were not pushed farther into the margins in their origins of work, which would actually lead to conditions of trafficking. The majority of women who work in massage businesses turn to massage work because it is more lucrative to pay off debt in order to, you know, earn enough money to get a massage license in the first place, compared to restaurant work and compared to nail salon work. All of that is to say, abolition is absolutely central to sex workers organizing and for massage workers to have rights in the United States. Yeah, and we're here for the full decriminalization of sex work, not partial criminalization, not the Nordic model, which has been rebranded as the equality model now, which would continue to rely on the police to criminalize everything around the worker, which essentially criminalizes the worker itself. And that is what I have to say. I guess one more point I really wanted to echo what CAAAV was talking about regarding gentrification. The police raid in Flushing that resulted in the death of Yang Song was coordinated with the city to clean up the road, the red light district road that she was on, in order for development to happen there, actually. So everything is interconnected. Like, all of our struggles are interconnected. And yeah, I really want to urge the inclusion of sex workers and massage workers in the conversation, because we see what happens when that is not included. Yeah, we see what happens when that is not included. Okay, thank you.
You speak. Thanks again to Chinatown Art Brigade and Creative Time for their consistent commitment to abolitionist organizing within New York City, as well as for coordinating this event among many others. I'm speaking from the Lenape-Hoking, where I live on the land of the Canary people. I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing glasses. I'm Indian. And I'll be reading from a statement I wrote for an Asian American feminist collective teach-in, but updated for today. I currently participate in various abolitionist fights. Thanks for naming them. And my goal today will be to provide my general sense of an understanding of the landscape of PIC abolition in New York City. On the flip side of New York City's celebrated history as a migration port is one marked by capitalism and anti-blackness. In the 18th century, the city's slave market was where Wall Street is now. A century later, Central Park was built over Seneca Village, a community founded by free working-class black people in uptown Manhattan. Around the same time, the modern NYPD came into existence to police Irish immigrants and stifle worker uprisings. It was soon after that Rikers was built. Jack Norton and Jared Shanahan write, Welfare Island, known as Blackwell's Island prior to 1921 as Roosevelt Island today, was a home to a cluster of institutions for sentenced prisoners, psychiatric patients, and the city's destitute. A progressive consensus began to coalesce around the idea that Welfare Island was in serious need of reform, Rikers Island would be that reform. I wanted to bring up the history of the city a bit to ground in the fact that not only has there long been a history of displacement, liberal co-optation of progressive demands and reformism, but that people have been working hard to end criminalization and establish a jail-free NYC for a long time. And to point out that our solidarity has to be rigorous. Yet the mix of capitalism, land theft, expanded criminalization, and aforementioned co-optation have produced a situation where we now have, in the city's proximity, 4 juvenile detention centers, 5 ICE facilities, 5 municipal jails, a federal correctional facility, and 1 penal colony known as Rikers Island. And I'm sure I'm missing some. This is not even to count the other criminalized spaces, including public housing, psychiatric facilities, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, foster care, and online. Meanwhile, NYCHA, as people have already said, New York City's public housing system has reached new lows, and there are upwards of 120,000 unhoused people in New York City. New York City's unemployment rate rose to 10% in 2020, well past the 6% national average. Instead of making public transit free, the city raises MTA fees by amounts that make the train inaccessible for many. Last summer, the NYPD beat and kidnapped protesters in the streets, but demands to defund the police were met with lackluster efforts from city council, as well as outright gaslighting and apathy. Over 4,000 people are held pre-trial in New York City adult jails with significant numbers of people on probation. When people are released, the prospects for housing, healthcare, job training, and emotional support are limited, and often find themselves tied up with police. Despite the existence of the transgender housing unit for prisoners, many trans women do not get access to the THU, and largely New York City jails enact relentless violence on Black survivors and trans women inside. And with the hard-won repeal of 50A, we have an even clearer picture of abuse by corrections officers within the jails towards people inside. Reductions to the jail population made at the beginning of the pandemic have been undone, and the appeal said that New York City has people on parole in jails at rates not seen since the early pandemic. Disregarding serious needs for social housing, deinstitutionalization of people in need of mental health care, and non-carceral economic support, the city's past many administrations and councils have been ruthless in their expansion of policing and imprisonment. Most recently, Bill de Blasio's police plan chose to expand criminalization despite massive protest, including increasing headcount and funding for NYPD. Notably, this plan aims to decriminalize sex work while focusing largely on punishing trafficking and not on the safety of survivors, as we just heard. In response to the white supremacist attacks against Asian people, city leaders like Margaret Chin choose to expand the Hate Crimes Task Force, even as Asian communities demand more resources such as language justice within city services and non-carceral protections. District attorneys and judges continue to request and set high bail amounts and aggressively keep people locked up or actively block organizers from getting people out. There is existing evidence that NYPD and ICE cooperate despite laws to prevent this from happening, and in typical fashion, the NYPD lies about increasing crime to obscure the reality that jails and police do not prevent or reduce so-called crime. Upwards of $8 billion is still currently allocated to the building of borough-based jails that will incarcerate many, many generations of New Yorkers under the guise of being better, more humane jails. Popular demands to close Rikers were manipulated into a plan that puts massive amounts of funding into maintaining incarceration. Renewable Rikers, a bill meant to improve NYC's environment, greenwashes the jail expansion plan by legitimizing jails as a way to close Rikers. The city continues to move forward with its plan for jail construction with AECOM, a firm known for being chosen to work on the COP Academy in Chicago. And less than half of the current city council candidates support closing Rikers without new jails. But abolitionists have held the line that a jail is a jail and that no reform which drives funds towards police and prisons is a viable path towards ending the PIC here in New York City and around the world. New York City has been home to major rebellions and actions against the PIC, including in honor of Eric Garner, Lillian Polanco, Khalif Browder, Akai Gurley. Yesterday, a little bit ago, at a rally to free Prakash Churman, I saw New Yorkers committed to ending incarceration. Participatory defense campaigns like the one to free Prakash, free Tracy, and free Malcolm, all people from New York City, have always lived in New York City, are just some that are using community defense to prevent reincarceration of our comrades. Campaigns like CUNY for Abolition and Safety and hashtag Abolish ACS are working hard to end police interactions New Yorkers have. People are coalescing to say that anti-Asian hate is not solvable through policing and sitting through day-long hearings to demand ICE contracts be ended. In New York City, we must continue to hold the line that an expansion of the PIC is never okay, even when major organizations and funders support it. It is imperative to say close Rikers without new jails and fund housing instead. The creation of new jails is not an effective way to close a penal colony. That itself was the consequence of reform. Instead, ending pretrial detention on a state level and passing serious bail reform, ending broken windows policing, and slicing away the power of corrections and police unions while defunding their institutions by half as soon as possible will drastically reduce the number of people in jail in New York City. When we can decarcerate, why expand? Prisoner solidarity and mutual aid are two steps, but it will take strong collective principled actions that are not only limited to political elections and timelines. This is a serious moment to be in solidarity with Black, undocumented, trans, disabled, and poor criminalized communities in the city, and I feel that we can rise to it. No one else is going to do it, and Abolition as a framework insists that we do it ourselves with incredible hope and discipline and care.
So last but not least, we have Diane Wong, who is a member of Chinatown Art Brigade, but also reading some solidarity statements and pledges from our allies in the Asian American movement. So here's Diane. Eat the mic.
Thanks. Is this on? Okay.
You have to eat it. Eat it.
It's so nice to see everyone. This is my first large-scale in-person event in years, so it's really nice to share space with all of you tonight. Is this sound okay? Louder? Okay. So I'm here to read a collective Asian Solidarity and Abolition statement on behalf of 18 Million Rising, which is an organization that brings Asian American communities together online and offline to reimagine Asian American identity with nuance, specificity, and power. So this pledge was collaboratively written by anchor abolition institutions and organizations, including Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta, API Women Lead, Creative Interventions, People's Collective for Justice and Liberation, Red Canary Song, Survived and Punished, and Southeast Asian Freedom Network. So I'm going to read the pledge, and I'm hoping that some of you, if you go home, will get a minute of time to sign up your name for the pledge. So as Asians and Asian Americans, we commit to ending the cycle of violence and harm towards Asians in all forms. We understand white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and capitalism are systems that have always and continue to perpetuate violence against our communities, which means the harm our communities face has everything to do with race, with gender, with class. We are clear that power and privilege varies across Asian American communities based on religion, immigration status, sexuality, ability, disability. The recent mass shootings targeting Asian women who are massage parlor workers, Sikh FedEx workers, in the face of increased daily attacks against Asian Americans has sparked a call to stop Asian hate. These attacks targeted some of the most vulnerable among us. Right now, our broader Asian American movement must make a decision. Will we keep a privileged few among us safe through hate crime legislation and increased policing, which we know already disproportionately impacts black lives every day? Or will we fight for true safety and freedom for all of us? We believe abolition is a path towards our collective freedom and liberation. We fight for all in our communities, including those who are massage parlor workers, sex workers, undocumented or refugees, evicted or houseless, detained, incarcerated, or deported. As Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free. We believe that building solidarity and centering those directly and disproportionately impacted is critical to justice and to liberation. We're rooted in revolutionary love. We will not allow systems of oppression to divide and conquer us, nor the communities we are part of and serve. We are not your fetish, not your racial wedge, not your model minority. We follow the analysis and center the leadership of survivor-led and local grassroots groups who are doing the organizing, narrative, and policy work that make alternative futures possible. Together, we will dream abolition into fruition that encourages us to live values that honor our humanity and self-determination. We commit as individuals and organizations to transform and to end the culture of policing, including the ways we embody police thinking, punitive patterns, and carceral ways of being with each other. We will find ways to address harm and conflict that do not include or expand punishments, police, or prisons, and including hate crime legislation. We will practice conflict transformation with principled struggle and care. We seek investment in our communities for healthcare, housing, employment, accountability structures that go beyond broken immigration systems, criminal injustice systems of policing, which is rooted in a system of chattel slavery. Furthermore, we know that American colonialism and imperialism bear responsibility for a country founded on white supremacy, anti-blackness, and indigenous genocide, and the ongoing violence perpetuated here, there, and across the globe. Many Asian communities resettled here because the U.S. military was in our homelands. We commit to sharing resources and power with transparency, equity, and mutuality. We lean into our own discomfort and turn towards each other as we build movements that can make and hold space with an abolitionist accountability pathway. We will practice principled ways of community care, transformative justice, and healing from the trauma we have endured and are still experiencing. So we invite you, all of you tonight, to join us by signing this collective Asian American Solidarity Abolition Pledge, which you'll find on the resource sheet that you picked up at the table earlier. So I'm hoping that some of you will just get a minute later on to sign the pledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Cool. So before we close out this portion, I just wanted to say that there are several calls to action that folks have articulated, and thank you, Esther, for just the way you encapsulated how
Eat the mic.
Eat the mic. Oh, thank you, Esther, for how you encapsulated how sort of the carceral state meets criminalization of sex work and gentrification and labor exploitation, right? I mean, that's essentially what we are talking about. Is when we say abolition, we're not saying it's something abstract or something theoretical, or that something is not based in our communities. We're talking about how do we envision abolition in our communities, that it is our issue. It's not abstract. We are living that in people's everyday lives, you know, caused by state-sanctioned violence, whether it's the state building condos and evicting and displacing working class folks in our community, whether it's through exploitation, labor exploitation, criminalization of sex work, right? Folks have really encapsulated every aspect of what we're talking about when we talk about this carceral state and abolition. What does that look like in our communities? One final call to action is that there is a jail, 4 jails that folks have mentioned, that are being built in New York City. You know, we call bullshit when the city says these jails are more humane because they provide UV light therapy, right? And this kind of bullshit that is more humane than Rikers Island. In fact, they've bought off tons of criminal justice reform groups. Ones that you all know, I won't name them, many of them who've been bought off and say, yeah, these jails are humane, we're for it. But we want to call out one institution in particular. The Museum of Chinese in America is the only nonprofit cultural group in New York City who's taking $35 million from the city in return for their blessing for this jail that is going to be built right in Chinatown, right? And we say that is bullshit. They are getting money. They are literally profiteering off of the criminalization of black and brown bodies. So we say boo, and let's continue to have this conversation. Boo! One other thing, Jonathan Chu, who is the board chair of the Museum of Chinese America, he is a 3rd-generation landlord in Chinatown. His grandfather made millions, continues to make millions off of buying and selling and speculation of land since the 60s. He is also the one trying to evict and union bust and end and close the only unionized restaurant in Chinatown, Jingfeng, right now. So this is just one guy. So labor exploitation, carceral state, and gentrification all combined in this fight. So when we say that it is real and it's palpable and it's a part of our everyday lives, we really, really, truly mean it. So anyway, I just wanted to say that because You know, it's happening right, you know, down the block, right? And the jails are being built, going to be built starting next year in the 4 boroughs minus Staten Island. And then we're gonna break out into groups now. And should we do the chant now?
Why don't we do it?
Okay, well let's do a chant. So Linda's gonna explain the breakout groups because we want you all to be able to learn more from these wonderful activists and leaders in the community, and talk about what this looks like in our own communities and talk that through. But we're gonna end with a chant, and I really invite folks to kind of lean in, and hopefully I can be loud and you all can repeat after me. But this is a chant that you all, I'm sure, have heard by Assata Shakur, who is a Black Panther freedom fighter, who is currently exiled in Cuba. I'm gonna say the first line, and please repeat. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love each other and support each other.
We must love each other and support each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
One more time, but louder. Okay. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love each other and support each other.
We must love each other and support each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
All right.
Let's just give another round of applause for our amazing speakers. So now we'll just take advantage of all getting to be together and break out in small groups. Our speakers will be around, and if you have additional questions for any of them or want to hear more about the work that they do, or just want to talk about something that you heard today and that resonated with you, or just talk abolition in our Asian American communities, find folks and gather and talk. And we also invite you to participate in our altar, as well as our writing activities. So there are red envelopes up here and paper where you can write messages or answer our prompt, what does a liberated future look like? And we encourage you to leave your envelopes at the altar. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Can you give a round of applause to Kim and Alberto again, please? And thank you to Creative Time, of course, which none of this could happen without the amazing staff, and Dia in particular, and Alex back there, and everyone else. Thank you very much.
Good, Nancy? No, she's doing pinner. Yeah, I was like, yeah.